What you're kind of describing is feels like, everyone should have an equal shot at getting access to the same opportunity.
If people in power don't actually perceive or believe that there's a problem, they're probably not going to spend that much money fixing the problem.
But if you use massive data sets like that, it's going to perpetuate the existing bias that exists within our system. And when it comes to HR technology specifically, that terrifies me.
Every data set has an agenda. You just need to find out what yours is.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Open to Work podcast. We are coming to you as ever on a Monday now on our new time slot to help set up your job search for the week. And this week we have got, it's a really special episode. We're taking a slightly different start here, and I've got a returning guest, friend of the podcast, Aubrey Branche-Sarellano. Welcome back to the podcast, Aubrey.
Hey, thank you so much for having me back. I'm always glad to be in conversation.
Well, and this is an extremely important, relevant conversation. And why I kind of, to set up the conversation, like why I wanted to bring you back was we are, now a week into that kind of the post-Trump 2.0 world. We have seen over the last kind of 2 years, diversity and inclusion jobs be absolutely decimated. And the entire industry seems to be kind of in a state of flux as in regards to what do we do around the concept of diversity and inclusion. And based on your unbelievable background, which I'll ask you to reintroduce yourself in a second, I wanted to dig into like what does this actually all mean for the general public, but then also for you as a candidate who's navigating a job search at this time. What does Meta or Amazon or the others cutting the diversity and inclusion teams actually mean, and what does this look like at scale? So before we get into that topic, which I'm so excited to talk about, as dark as it might be on the outside, why don't we really briefly reintroduce yourself so we can set that up?
Yeah. So, hey, everyone, I'm Aubrey Branche-Sarellano. My day job, I'm the VP of Equitable Operations at CultureAmp. What that means is I look after sort of people operations, equity and inclusion, sustainability, and philanthropy. I'm also a consultant, so the founder at the Math Path. And within my consulting work, I look at equitable processes, organizations, and technology. So if it's ethics or equity related, people call me to help them make things a little less biased. So yeah, I would say that I've been doing, this work in the tech industry and kind of across sectors for about a decade now. And so I'm definitely older. I like to think I'm at least a little bit wiser and probably a little bit more cynical after a decade as well. But I also think that makes me a bit realistic, which I hope is helpful to folks in a season like this.
Yeah, and for someone who works in topics that are like quite like ethics and diversity and inclusion, you're coming into us like bright and bold. For anyone who's listening, Aubrey's got this beautiful pink, vibrant hair that I think she's only got done the last couple of weeks, and is really saying no to any negative vibes in the room today.
Yeah, you got to have good vibes. If people can tell from my accent, I'm American. And so it's been a pretty rough week to be from the US, although I do live in Australia. But yeah, I mean, good vibes always. But I think, yeah, it's definitely a week where if you're reading the headlines, there's a ton of doom and gloom. And the reality is
Mm-hmm.
that there's a ton of people, I'm speaking about the US in particular, which is home for me, that have been like actively targeted. And I don't want to minimize that. I think it's real. I think it's scary. But I also think these kind of like, the tales of DEI's death have also been greatly exaggerated. And I think it's important to
Mm-hmm.
take a really measured approach to understand what's happening currently, because I think that helps us be kind of effective moving forward.
And before we start looking at the now, let's look at the past.
Mhm.
So, what is the role of someone who does diversity and inclusion? What does this role do? Where does it come from? And why is it important?
Yeah, so there is kind of a long history of this work being done, and it's had a bajillion names over the last few decades. But I think the ultimate objective of whether it was affirmative action or diversity or multiculturalism or DEI, or these new titles with justice and things like that in it, the core of the role was to do whatever was needed to help an organization operate in a way that created fairness, non-discrimination, and equal opportunity for people no matter what background they have. So the idea is the logic of forming a role is we understand that the world isn't fair, that
Hmm.
discrimination does happen and it tends to happen to very particular types of people. And so organizations that buy in say we need an expert to help us make sure that doesn't happen here. So a DEI expert is going to work across communications, process design, program management, change management, kind of looking across the organization and saying what's important here and what's potentially driving unfair outcomes, and how do we develop different structures within the organization to combat that. So there's a huge swath of different skill sets within this field, and I think that's something that's important is most practitioners have a specialty, but very few of us kind of do everything.
It sounds like an element of that is ensuring that the company is like legally in the right situation. But from working, when it's done really, really well, it's really a business growth driver, is my understanding. Perhaps you can elaborate on that a little bit more.
Yeah, so certainly I think I kind of think of compliance. If you think of an organization kind of like a house, that compliance
Hmm.
obligations are kind of like putting the foundation or putting the floor in that at minimum you need to make sure that you're minding your anti-discrimination laws, or in the UK, for example, gender pay gap analysis needs to be done. And so there are those compliance-based things that certainly DEI teams are involved in. But at the end of the day, kind of the positive outcomes of this work are the types of things that I think are pretty common sense. So people have a sense of psychological safety, a sense of belonging. That increases their motivation and increases their capability to perform in their role. There's also lots of research that shows that balanced or diverse teams tend to produce better ideas and better solutions to
Hmm.
problems. Um, there's a lot of research that people cite about the fact that like diversity drives business performance. I think that's generally true, but I think the like you hire three women and suddenly your stock price goes up, like A to B kind of research is a bit sketchy. But I think overall, there's so many factors that creating a positive environment for people and bringing different people together creates for businesses that I'll be honest, at this point in 2025, I have a really hard time believing that leaders who don't know that are qualified for their jobs.
And I think that leads us in because we've seen the civil service in America really kind of publicly say that they're going to cut these departments. Meta and Microsoft have publicly stated they're looking to reduce these departments. The civil service in the UK under the Conservative government were reviewing of removing these equitable design and inclusion roles. If these roles are kind of so critical, like why do you feel they're being cut right now?
The really honest answer is that I believe that the work of these roles genuinely benefits everyone. But the reality is, often the most visible gains or improvements happen for people who are marginalized or undervalued in the workplace.
Hmm.
The reality is, most of the people in power, there's lots of research about this, but actually, Culture Amp's 2022 Workplace DEI report, so a little bit older data, actually showed, for example, that white employees were the least likely to believe that their organization was unfair. And so we tend to know, right, white people tend to hold positions of leadership. We tend to see similar patterns for men compared to women. And so if people in power don't actually perceive or believe that there's a problem, they're probably not going
Hmm.
to spend that much money fixing the problem.
So, based on a survey done across a number of different leaders,
Mhm.
it was shown that white leaders tended to feel that their workplace was not unfair.
Correct.
And so, as a result, are less likely to consider investing in programs that drive fairness.
Correct, because they believe that it's already fair. And so, and again, you
Hmm.
tend to see similar patterns for any majority group. It's not just white folks. But that is a core part of the problem is just that if the world tends to be tilted in your advantage, at best, you simply are unaware of that fact. And at worst, you're
Hmm.
actively holding people down to keep yourself on top.
Without, I mean, this is like an inherently political topic, even though it feels like it shouldn't be, and is like at the heart of culture wars and in lots of different countries. But it feels like we're at a point in time where this is considered like wokeness, quote unquote wokeness. Whereas what you're kind of describing is it feels like, everyone should have an equal shot at getting access to the same opportunity. Why, I guess, if you were kind of responding to like the times, would someone
Yeah.
or would someone not have access to the same opportunities in the current world?
Yeah, so I think my answer is that the world's never really been fair. So, like the fact is that, I will speak about the US because that's, where I'm from, but the fact is for hundreds and hundreds of years, for example, Black people were literally not legally classed as human beings. Like
Hmm.
that's pretty bad on the scale of everything. And so when you think about, oh, magically the world became fair in 100 years after that, that's not how that works. And so if that was the starting point and people have actively fought getting to equality through the entire time that the country's been in existence, it seems like a pretty far leap to believe that suddenly someone snaps their fingers and suddenly we're all playing on a level playing field. And you could say the same thing about disabled folks or about women or about trans and otherwise queer people. And so I think that's it, is like it is truly hard to come up with a set of data that would tell us that the world is fair at present.
And even in where you are currently residing, Aboriginal, the kind of indigenous communities of Australia and First Nation people were still considered as like fauna until the
Mhm.
90s. So like within our lifetime, they were still not considered humans under law. And by kind of just that is not enough time to reset and establish an equality within a country for people. Like we just need decades more.
Right. Or you need extraordinary efforts to try to create equal opportunity within the
Yeah.
sphere of influence you have. And so I think, I talk to business leaders and it's the idea that no, you can't solve all of social inequality with your company. You can't, but you can make sure, because you can assume that you're going to inherit it if you don't do something about it.
Hmm.
You can decide not to inherit it. And that's kind
Hmm.
of the basis of which I work from, is like our Culture Amps founders understand where the status quo is, and that's not the
Hmm.
experience they want people to have at their organization. So for them, it's we want everyone to be treated with dignity, to feel a sense of belonging and growth when they're working
Hmm.
for us. And if that's true, we know that we have to invest in specific supports or investments to make sure that everyone has that experience, knowing that not everybody has the same set of barriers to achieve it.
I think it's funny that sounds like there's an absolute storm raging
There
overhead
is
in
it, like a
Sydney.
thunderstorm just rolled in.
Which yeah is such an interesting like backdrop for this entire conversation. This like, lethal storm above
Mixed
you.
mood.
So Alderson James are one of the leading people and talent agencies. Since 2013, they've been responsible for over 1,000 people and talent hires, including one in a company that I used to work at. They helped me hire my head of technology TA. So I know the guys there pretty well. They've been responsible for scaling some of the most innovative companies in the UK and the EU. Also recently just launched in the US. So even folks in your neck of the woods now, James, can get involved for contingent, retained, and executive search. And they also now do embedded through AJX. So they can do it all. Well, I think one of the like misunderstandings from any sort of diversity and inclusion or quote unquote like woke program is that in order for other people to be leveled up, you as a result as like a majority group get leveled down. And I don't feel like that is necessarily like the core focus of like that's necessarily true. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think most of the things that like are that are advocated for in the workplace, at least speaking about my team at Culture Amp, are things that benefit everyone. So when I came in 5 years ago, one of the first things we put in place was audits for our promotion, pay, and performance processes from 7 different dimensions of identity to make sure that there's no weirdness in the distributions. We don't, for example, just audit to make sure women aren't treated fairly. We look to audit for people not being treated unfairly on the basis of
Hmm.
their gender, whatever that gender happens to be. So that's not a
Hmm.
zero sum thing. Or, you know, an extension of parental leave policies and benefits. That's something that's quote woke, and that benefits, if done correctly, parents of all genders. And so, or, as an example, at Culture Amp, we have a really progressive accommodations and adjustments policy. That's something we offer to every employee. They don't have to out themselves as disabled to use it. It's available to everyone. And so it's like, wow, a workplace where everyone can ask for the support they need so they can perform. Like, if that's a problem to you, I genuinely question your priorities.
And when we see companies like Microsoft and Meta and there'll be many more, let's be honest, behind the scenes that are kind of quietly cutting, and you'll be able to commentate on this much more than I will from being within the industry. It feels like there are just fewer jobs available for diversity inclusion leaders and individuals at the moment. What do you feel like is the broader impact on businesses, but then also kind of society as a whole from when we cut these programs?
It's always a shame to see companies back down from kind of stated commitments, I think, in a way. But my perhaps a bit contrarian perspective is that it can also be a good thing because there's a lot of marginalized people who see branding on a company and think that they're going to be treated well, and that company isn't authentically investing in equity and inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And so they go there and they're mistreated. And so I really believe that I would much prefer every business be honest about their priorities, even if those aren't priorities that I would align with. Because what that means, to talk to so many of your listeners, is that those job seekers now have more information to help them decide whether an organization is one that they want to contribute to. So, like, yeah, I want more people on the team always. I love to do more work together. But at the end of the day, like, it gives job seekers power to choose what's going to work for them. I also think that the media is really unhelpful in this moment, in that I have seen so many more headlines about companies that are cutting back on these programs when there are an equal number of companies who have doubled down and made public statements about continuing their commitment. It's just not as shiny. And then I really appreciate you bringing up the Microsoft example specifically, because if you dig in, what actually happened is that 2 roles on their events team were eliminated because they were duplicative. They actually didn't cut their DEI program. They just had 2 extra roles at the company that were doubling up on work that the DEI team was doing. And so they had some redundancies, which is honestly a pretty boring news
Totally
for a
normal.
large corporate.
Yeah.
But the media grabbed a hold of it and said that Microsoft canceled their DEI efforts. And that just literally wasn't what happened. And so I think it's
Mm-hmm.
really important, as we read those headlines, acknowledge that there are some big name companies that are cutting those programs. But at the end of the day, that is clarity for job seekers, and they can choose to take their time and talents to organizations that prioritize things that align with their values.
There's two elements I want to dig back into there. One is the like public perception of diversity and inclusion versus what's actually happening within a business. I like what do you put on your careers page versus what's happening in the company. And then the second element is this kind of scale of like leftism kind of culture creep, right? Where actually, like, if you look back a decade ago, there are still more diversity and inclusion roles now than there were then. I likely I'd love to go and cite the data on that and include it in the show notes. But like, we are still moving upwards and to the right in regards to like our focus as a society on diversity and inclusion, even though the media would sort of have you feel otherwise, which I think is its own point. So just going back to that first point though, how do we as a candidate distinguish between the kind of Benetton ad employer branding for a careers page versus what's actually happening and how people are supported in an equitable way within a business?
So I think the reality is that really good DEI work is incredibly boring and behind the scenes, and employees mostly do not care that you're doing it, which can be rough. So what people tend to see is like when you bring in a speaker or they're aware of like their ERGs, and those can be important parts of a strategy. Like, I don't want to say that they're irrelevant, but often folks will not ask questions about the type of things that actually predict fair outcomes. So, if I was giving advice to job seekers, I think what I would tell you is never, ever, ever ask, does your company care about DEI or does your company care about equity and inclusion? Anyone will lie to you and say yes, regardless of what's going on internally. But also, recognizing that your interviewer or your hiring manager might not know everything about the DEI strategy at that company. So, what's a better question is something like, what have you done to contribute to an inclusive culture at X company, because every
Mhm.
person, if the company does care, should be able to speak to their own story. And that could be, I educated myself about a topic, I am an ally to an ERG, or I'm a part of an ERG, or by the way, like my team participates in the pay equity audits. So there's this kind of unlimited set of answers, but what you're looking for is that someone, it is not the first time they've thought about that topic when you're asking the question.
Mhm.
And then if you want to know about the broader program, speak to your recruiter and say, this is really important to me. Could you share anything with me about the way the company views this and what kind of programs that entails?
And I've been asked these questions like multiple times, and very rarely is it yeah, we do really well as like the response. Because if any company turns around and is like, yeah, we're smashing it, we're really really good at diversity and inclusion, then they probably like, I would love to please cite your sources. Often it's an ongoing growth journey for us, and we are hopefully trying to get steadily and like improve every day and every month. But the reality is there's still a long way to go, and their answer should probably be somewhere along that continuum with like also here's an action that we're trying to take at the moment.
Yeah, and I also think it's important to talk about like current challenges because,
Hmm.
so for as an example, as I said, I've been at Culture Amp for about 5 years, and when I first came on board, we had a huge focus on Black equity and our Black employees, and we saw a huge increase in their experience, the quality of their experience, to the point where a huge proportion of our Black employees' engagement was actually higher than average for their non-Black peers, because we had prioritized their experience. What we saw a couple of years later is that quality of experience started to slip. So we saw noticeable
Hmm.
areas where they didn't feel as included, where they had skepticism around career growth. And so something that just a year before had been great wasn't working in the current environment. Obviously, a lot of things in the business changed in that time. And so my team actually refocused in 2024 on our Black employees. And by investments we made, by doing listening sessions, quantitative data analysis, we were able to invest in programs that actually boosted their engagement by 20 percentage points. So I think it's also important to
Hmm.
talk to a business about what are your current challenges with DEI, because they're going to change from year to year, and the different populations are going to need different types of support over time. So I think to your point, that's why there's not really an endpoint. At Culture Amp, we think about this idea of equitable design, or when we go into a planning cycle, we ask the question, who's most in need of support now? And that determines where we put our investment and our focus. And that can change on a 6 or 12 month cycle. It doesn't mean we really leave anyone out, but our theory of change says that when we focus on folks who are the most vulnerable, we kind of raise the boats for everybody.
Yeah, and I was first introduced to that theory by you, and I've absolutely I've always followed that kind of through the rest of my career. And so like again, like this isn't saying that their experience is now significantly better than the average experience. It's just bringing that experience back up to being consistent with the rest of the organization, which I think is really like what a lot of this stuff is about. And those people will now have a better productive relationship. They're more likely to get promoted. They're enjoying their work better. They feel more a part of the business. And like those are all things that, regardless of your background, I think we can all get behind.
Yeah, and as an example of an initiative that we piloted, so when we did listening sessions with our Black employees, one of a core piece of feedback was, I'm not experiencing psychological safety at work. And so
Mm-hmm.
we actually created enablement for managers about how to increase psychological safety at work. And we sort of rolled that out first to managers of
Mm-hmm.
Black employees, because that was where the urgent need was. But that training's actually like this year, we're continuing to roll it out to the rest of managers. And so that's an exact area where it's not like woke in some way that's going to get branded that way, but it was grounded in the needs of a particularly marginalized population. But ultimately, every manager who takes that training is going to be more competent to support their people, regardless of the background of what their direct
Yeah.
reports are. And so that's an example of where we're not picking and choosing who wins. It's actually win-win solutions that we're generating.
Yeah. And when this translates again to kind of someone who's not working, it means that when companies are investing in this, they're likely investing in, like, they're going to be more broadly aware of how they can support you, regardless of how regard and interview you, regardless of your background. And they're going to be more aware because they're having a more out kind of conversation around like some of the biases that they may hold, and then how to kind of engage with those biases through an interview process. And they're designing an equitable process from the start. And all of these things set you up for success. So if you can identify these businesses that are working on these sorts of operational mechanics to help across their entire business, they're probably also doing it in recruiting, because recruiting is often seen somewhat like correctly, somewhat incorrectly, as like one of the core areas of access to diversity and inclusion efforts.
We are so excited to be sponsored by HireGuide. HireGuide is an end-to-end interview decision platform that makes hiring decisions faster, fairer, and twice as predictive of on-the-job employee performance. As a recruiting leader, I've been looking for a tool that can help me run better interviews across my organization at scale to make better hiring decisions. So when I found HireGuide, I thought all my hopes had been answered. They use cutting-edge AI and behavioral science to enable you to operationalize structured interviews and skills-based hiring that can help you find those star candidates. Hiring a dream team is no easy task, but with HireGuide, it can be.
So we now have to ring the AI bell. I'd love to hear like your perspective on like whether or not AI is helping us, is going to move the conversation forward. Like, what are some of the inherent risks that AI will bring to creating an equitable workplace?
Yeah, so I share a deep level of cynicism. So one of my areas of consulting is kind of bias in equity in AI. And so I think the average company that's selling you like AI as creating fairness, I have a lot of questions. Like, I will go in skeptical, but I'm open to be proven wrong. But I think the basic is that, especially if you're using things like generative AI, the underlying foundational models are probably pretty biased, or like, so they'll either create new biases or they'll just exacerbate the biases that tend to exist in the world. I think there are some solutions that are applying artificial intelligence in ways that work and mitigate bias, but overall, I think the basic assumption should be that artificial intelligence is going to make things worse unless it's really intentionally designed to make things better.
What perpetual biases is OpenAI bringing to the table in those sorts of products?
I think OpenAI is a great example because folks can actually go and read OpenAI's model cards for their models. So for folks who don't know, a model card is basically a document that lays out the specifications for a particular model, how it was trained, how the data was used, but it also can illuminate the kinds of biases or gaps in knowledge or capability that the model has. And so OpenAI actually broadly admits that ChatGPT was trained on a data set that it's biased towards English language, for example. We also know that like language on the internet tends to be filled with racism, misogyny, ableism, etc. And so that means that any models trained on like open source or scraped across the internet are going to have those inherent biases in them. And so if someone is selling you AI, the correct question, whether or not they're claiming to make something unbiased, is help me understand what you've done to correct the biases in the underlying data set, and how does your application work to create more fairness? Walk me
Mm-hmm.
through that. And if you don't know how to
Mm-hmm.
evaluate that, there are experts out there to help you. But I think starting with the sniff test of like, if they don't have a really
Mm-hmm.
thoughtful answer to that question, or they fumble about it, then the answer is it may be a little smoke and mirrors. And I will tell you, most of the AI hype right now is smoke and mirrors, regardless of whether we're talking
Yeah.
about bias or not.
I just don't believe that within the product that was released within the last 12 to 18 months, which realistically most AI oriented products have probably been released and built in the last 18 months, unless they're like attached essentially to something that's already existed for a long period of time,
Yeah.
is just plugging in a skin onto like a slightly better trained OpenAI product, or a couple of different language models together. And what they probably haven't done is rigorously train a model to remove them of this sort of bias. The other problem I think with training when it comes to like HR specifically is the concept of performance. And I'm sure that you will know this better than almost anyone. Like, people at the top of the tree who are deemed high performers typically look and sound and feel the same, in that they are typically white men in most businesses. And as if you look at top performers across a business and use that as a training data set, you're going to find they're college educated. You're going to find they've gone to an Ivy League school. You're going to find that they probably went to like Salesforce or blah, blah, blah. And they went to, they were able to use their privilege to get to the position that they're in today. I'm not saying they're not bright, because they all probably are. But that doesn't mean that they are exclusively the ones that are going to be good at this job. But if you use massive data sets like that, it's going to perpetuate the existing bias that exists within our system. And when it comes to HR technology specifically, that terrifies me.
I think that's right. And there's a story about, thankfully, Amazon, killed the project before it went live, but they built an in-house AI to like sort resumes, and they started to
Mm-hmm.
field it, and they figured out that what the AI learned was that women weren't qualified for jobs because there had been a historical imbalance in their hiring, like most other tech companies. I don't think it's useful to call them out in this regard. And so they realized that because they hadn't thought about the underlying bias, the model was producing and exacerbating biased outcomes. I also think, to your point about, it's really important to understand that in the context of AI within HR applications, is that there is more and more regulation around things like that. So, for example, the EU AI Act actually classifies the use of AI in employment as a high risk use case, which is subject to significantly more regulatory scrutiny, testing, and documentation. And so certainly, that's in the EU, but what we're seeing is companies tend to comply with that, similar to GDPR, is it's become the global standard in kind of what people are building for. And there's significant penalties for not complying with that law. It is starting to come into force kind of over the next 2 years. And so I think that would be my other question, is like, how have you thought about bias? What kind of documentation is available about your testing process for this? Because I am not finding a lot of compelling answers to those questions when I talk to smaller companies who are kind of in an AI land grab, and maybe haven't actually employed an ethicist or someone who's an expert in responsible technology.
Well, who do you think who are the polar sides of this? Who's doing it really well and who's doing it really badly?
Yeah, so the two companies that I kind of look to, so one, they've been doing kind of generative AI for a long time, is Textio. So
Mm-hmm.
their former CEO, Karen Snyder, she says, like, every data set has an agenda. You just need to find out what yours is. And I think that's such a smart way to think about data, is that every data set is biased. You just need to know what that bias is and understand whether it's one that you can tolerate or want. But I think Textio has always been thinking about bias in language. And so I really have appreciated the way that they've pioneered that space. The second company that I've like been a fangirl of probably for the last, like, since they were formed. They're based in London. They're called Applied. And so they have historically been recruiting technology. And I've kind of watched them go through a transformation last year where they've started to bring AI into their solution. But the reason I'm really optimistic about it is because I think that the structure of their solution was really smart to begin with. And they are employing AI to exacerbate the goodness that their product was already creating. So they're not just slapping an AI on it.
Mm-hmm.
They've actually, from what I understand, designed their product in a way that it actually leverages what's great about AI while not asking it to do things that get it into trouble.
What's probably impacting individuals as they go through candidate processes today is most likely going to be not an AI reviewing your CV. Again, very few businesses are doing this. It's super, like, just to give you some context, like integrating a third-party technology to scrape and evaluate your CV with that much personal identifiable information to it is like a company's worst nightmare when it comes to data processing, and they would do as much as they possibly can to prevent that from happening. Because again, if they can't really clearly understand how that data is being used, they're just not going to do it. And so at scale, there might be the odd use case here or there. But again, like I spoke to a CEO the other day who was using this to try and like shortcut their recruiting practice, and outfit the 15 CVs that the AI found, all 15 of them were written by an AI. So there we go. Like it's not really being used effectively at scale. So let's ignore that as a technology. The one that I see most perpetually used is psychometric testing or some sort of skills, quote unquote, skills-based testing. I've got like a perspective on this, but as like a diversity and inclusion expert, I see you shake your head. Like, what's like the pros and cons of using a psychometric testing? Because they do display it to be this is to help us you hire more in a more inclusive way.
It just like I would say any kind of profiling and testing used to make like employment-based decision freaks me out. Like I think most of those like constructs again were created profiling particular people, and I think it lacks like cultural sensitivity and things like that. I was going to say one of my new favorite use cases for AI is, for example, to take a transcript of an interview and ask for summaries of answers to questions so that you can more effectively
Mhm.
evaluate answers against a rubric.
And you can check out our sponsor HireGuide if you'd like to see any more about that.
Oh, I didn't know that. That was not an intention. But like that's something that I'm using AI for, is to like summarize meetings that I'm in so I can be more present, but still have
Mhm.
summaries to get back to me. And so I think again, it's about using this technology in a way that's responsible and effective. Because at the end of the day, if I, as an interviewer, am spending less time writing up my feedback, that means I have more time to spend on employing strategies to make objective decisions. And so I could probably speed up the process for you as a candidate, which probably feels better. But I'm also able to give you a more objective process if I'm kind of outsourcing manual tasks as an interviewer. So again, I don't want to say like out with the AI, but you need to be smart about how you use it.
Our sponsors will be delighted that you've said that completely unprompted. I think that I completely agree, and that's why I've always been interested in this space. I do believe that interviewing is the final frontier for like technology as a whole, like HR technology as a whole. And I think over the next 5 years, we'll just see it completely perpetuate through most interviewing, but also in meetings. Like we are now transcribing most of our meetings in the company where I currently work, and then we're also like scoring those meetings. We're using data to analyze the productivity of those meetings and be able to store and build up a repository within our own like safe and secure ecosystem of like what are we talking about, how are we talking about it, and is that productive use of our time. So again, I think these there will be like we do need to be skeptical, more broadly speaking, around like how are we using technology. I think at all times, and as a candidate, I would say like don't worry too much right now about the different technologies and whether or not you're being biased as a result. Like in the worst case scenario, the bias is going to be the same as it was before because you're reliant on a recruiter like that's always also bringing their biases to the table or being biased. So I would say that they're probably not impacting you more disproportionately more right now. What I'm worried about is in a few years' time, if as these models get more and more investment and more data behind them, what is the data that's being used and how is that going to impact you as a candidate? One final question then for you. So like looking into the future, what do you think companies should be doing to create fairer workplaces? And for job seekers, what should they keep in mind as they navigate all these changes?
So I would say for employers is simply ask the question, do you believe everyone should be treated well at your workplace? And if the answer is no, that your workplace is only for a particular type of person, put that on your website. You will get the talent that you deserve if that's your priority and your value. And I'm not here to shame. I just think we should all be transparent about those priorities. And then for job seekers, I think be clear about what values are important to you and whether a company authentically investing in that is important to you, and know that. And as you're considering companies, don't believe the careers page. Anybody can slap some pretty words on a website. I think it's about having authentic conversations. And are you more often than not in conversations with people at an organization? Are they able to talk about the steps they've taken on their inclusion journey? Do they feel authentically bought in? That's going to tell you a lot more than anything that you could read in that college campus brochure.
Amazing. A lot of companies that I worked throughout my career, and I think culture I'm the same, is like slightly left leaning in some of the values that it portrays to the
Mm-hmm.
world. And as a result, in the context of these slightly more like left leaning groups, the people who are legitimate voters are an interest of people like Donald Trump and stuff like that, and are or conservative voters in the context of the UK, or reform voters, are marginalized groups in these sorts of businesses. How do you balance that kind of mindset in creating an inclusive environment for people who are politically that different and polarized from what your founder might feel or from what your CEO might feel?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. So I think for me, what's really important, even though, we definitely, our employees tend to have more of a left-leaning slant, is that the work way that we do, we one, ground it and connect it to the company mission and values, but we also try to ground it in values that I think are resonant regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum. Now, if you're straight up racist and you think that, for example, white people are just inherently superior, like there are many reasons I don't want you in my company. Mostly, I can't even trust you to adhere to non-discrimination laws. But I think saying things like, what data shows us is that when you say something like, I believe people should be treated fairly, people across the political spectrum can get on board with that. Or everyone should feel supported to do their best work here. And so I think it's really important to ground this work in kind of fundamental values, but also in aligning them to the business's values. So I think it's that simple. Is I have more and more pulled away from language that's overtly political, because I find that it alienates people who, in their personal values, are actually very much on the team. And I would rather us use language that resonates with a broader set of people while still doing the projects that we need to do to create like the positive work environment. So it's about finding language that resonates and speaking to people with different value sets or common values that may describe those values very differently. But I think you also have to be honest that there are people who have really terrible values, and those are not the people that you're looking to communicate with. It doesn't mean we need to shame them or treat them poorly, but we just have to be clear that if your value is about excluding or dehumanizing other people, we're not on board with that.
That's such a fantastic answer, and I feel like it's potentially not the first time you've given that answer as well. If it was, then well done. Thank you so much, Aubrey. This has been such a fantastic episode. I think it's been a slight departure from our normal episode, but I think it's really important to kind of contextualize these really complex and nuanced debates that are happening, especially when, as you kind of to your point earlier, like the media is so aggressively trying to talk down the value of things like diversity and inclusion in businesses and in our workplaces right now. Whereas the reality is that's underpinning all of this, like high tide raises all boats. And when we create fairer workplaces, that's something that regardless of where you stand on the political spectrum, we can all get behind. And I think that it's such as a candidate listening to this, or as someone who's just in the world, like these are things that we should all care about. And hopefully if you're a job seeker, have slightly more kind of arrows in your quiver to be able to understand whether or not a company is really doing the work behind the scenes that it might look like it's doing on its college campus, employer branding.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure, and I'm sure this won't be the last time we hear of each other. Even if it is an odd time for both of us, we still managed to make this work, which just goes to kind of the power of what mission we're trying to get behind here. And to anyone listening, obviously we come out every single Monday. But Aubrey, where can we find you if we want to hear more about your view on the world?
Yeah, so I would say you can find me on LinkedIn or at aubreyblanche.com.
And then you can obviously continue to follow us here on at the Open to Work podcast. You can write in and ask us any questions at opentoworkpod@gmail.com. You can subscribe to our newsletter where you'll get unique content straight into your inbox every Sunday. That's the Get Hired Toolkit. .com. And thank you so much for tuning in this week, and good luck on your job search this week. Aubrey, thanks again.
Thank you.